my choice of colour on the slide means that I'm hiding my identity, but I have been introduced. So I'm Julia, and I'm in the Christian Muslim Forum capacity only. I am Morris's other half, Christian other half, and I'm from Warwick University, Warwick Religions and Education Research Unit. Okay. And it's very good to be here, so many thanks for the invite and the opportunity. I was quite interested by the title of this seminar, quite an interesting one which has both a question mark and also uses parentheses. So I intend to make use of the license of the ambiguity of that title to move beyond the sort of so-called faith schools for a moment, to look at a broader context of faith, or perhaps I should say of religion in schools in general, and that contextualization, I hope, will help us to see where these so-called faith schools fit. I'm going to have to stop doing this all the time, but whenever I say faith schools, if you can imagine it, it's got these sort of, query speech marks behind it. Okay. Behind what I say, there will be the understanding that society in which we live and work, and for which we are preparing our young people, those of us involved in education, is both religious and secular. And behind what I say, there will also be the understanding that everything is rather fuzzy. It is England after all. We don't have the clear-cut distinction between religious school and secular school that our neighbours across the channel have, for example. Yes, we do have schools with a designated religious character, but even where schools don't have this religious status, they are not given alternative secular status. They are still legally bound to provide, they might not do it, to provide daily acts of worship and religious education for all students. Religion is still there. So that's a bit fuzzy. Another point of fuzziness, which has already been alluded to, is that while some of our faith schools have students only from that faith, others, most of them indeed, have pupils from other faiths and from none. And in some cases, those pupils are actually in the majority. So there's an absence of a neat separation between secular and religious in English education, and that can lead to ambiguities and confusions on the ground, but it can also have a positive significance in conversations between religious and secular, because it can enable discussion to move away from simplistic conceptualizations of the two as necessarily independent and opposite. PowerPoint. Okay. I'm going to explore the place of religion and the relationship between the religious and secular in schools with the aid of material from 20 detailed case studies carried out by myself and colleagues in the Warwick Religions and Education Research Unit in 2008 and 9. And the main focus of that research was actually religious education, but other aspects of the school's handling of religion were also studied. Data was collected through interviews with pupils, with teachers, with head teachers, sometimes with governors, maybe with school chaplains, through observations of lessons and collective worship, examination of school prospectuses, school policies, school plans, and so on. And the schools were very diverse, 10 secondary, 10 primary, maintained and independent, with and without a designated religious character. This here gives you an idea of the range of schools. Among these schools, we found a wide variety of responses to religion. For schools of a religious character, those faith schools, the faith-based ethos might be implicit, founded on values drawn from the faith tradition, but not stating the law. Alternatively, explicit reference might be made to God and to God's activity in the school and its community. Schools without a designated religious character also presented various responses to religion. It might be treated with caution as potentially divisive, celebrated as integral to students' identity and culture, or valued as presenting alternative perspectives to dominant secular discourses. So taken together, schools with or without designated religious character, their approaches religion could be categorised under three headings. Here they are. Doxological approaches, where the life and work of the school is bound up with religious witness and praise. Sacramental approaches, entailing the demarcation within the school of places and moments open to religious significance. And instrumental approaches, employing and adapting religious content for educational and societal rather than religious ends. There is no one approach adopted by all schools with a religious character, or all schools without a religious character. Different approaches were found in different schools within both of those categories, and sometimes different approaches within the same school. So I'm going to begin with the doxological approach. A doxological approach, in my understanding, explicitly acknowledges and proclaims the primacy of God in the life, the work, and the relationships of the school. Thus, the values promoted at the state-maintained Jewish primary school, though common to most schools, care, respect, have the authority of God's law. The head teacher explained, the values are predicated on texts, and that's the difference. So we talk about the Torah, we'll talk about specific parts of the Bible. According to the school prospectus, its ethos is founded on an awareness and love of God, encouraged through daily and weekly patterns of worship. The stated aim of the collective worship policy is to develop the children's communication with God. So school life is both responding to and addressing God. A doxological approach allows religious faith to permeate the space of the school. It's evident in a South London Church of England primary school, where each classroom has a prayer corner with a crucifix, Bible and prayer books. There is a reminder in prominent corridor displays that we are the body of Christ, and, as the chair of governors observed, there are little pictures and sentences and symbols all around the school that say actually these are connected to our faith. The children interviewed were well aware of this connection. Talking about the crucifix, they said, it is to help about Jesus died for us, for our sins. It's like to teach the children how it is to be good, follow all the laws God has told us that we have to obey because Jesus died for us. At the Islamic primary school, God is part of the language of the school, and this is where my problems begin because they use a lot of Arabic. I'm not going to presume to say the Arabic words here, I'll just translate them. So the lessons will begin with the Quranic invocation. We've heard from Morris already, my Lord, increase me in my knowledge. The school lexicon includes phrases such as all praise is due to God, when something positive has occurred in the lesson. May God reward you with goodness, when recognising someone's efforts, and God has willed it, used for appreciation instead of applause. At the time of the research, the deputy head teacher was engaged in a project to promote closer integration between Islamic studies and the rest of the curriculum. So more subjects would include references to Islamic history, culture, and morality. Here too, the aim is for the whole of the school's activity to be response and address to God. In these institutions, the life of the school is in dialogue with God, but the school is also part of God's dialogue with the world. The Roman Catholic secondary school reflected both dialogues by stressing in its policies two aspects of the Catholic tradition: the prayerful community, nurtured through daily worship, following the Church's liturgical year, annual retreats for the students, and faith in action, in particular following Jesus' example of service, fundraising for charities, voluntary work in the community, campaigns for social justice, including lobbying Parliament on behalf of asylum seekers. Similarly, it is stated in the South London Church Primary School that it should bear witness in the community to God's transforming love and his purpose for the future we are building together. In an area of intense socio-economic deprivation, the head teacher of this Church of England school states explicitly that God's transforming power is to be realised and proclaimed through the transformation of the life chances of the children. The Islamic Primary has written into its policy that the students are ambassadors for their faith, working for the betterment of society. Posters in front of the school directed to passers-by use words from the Quran and Hadith to signal a love of neighbour. This school too gets involved in charitable fundraising, community activities, including working one of the neighbourhood allotments, singing nasheeds at a local old people's home and holding open days for the public. These are important to the school's self-understanding, but more important is the aim expressed by the head teacher to support the moral regeneration of society and to help restore hope. These schools have a publicly proclaimed relationship to God involving a message and a mission to the wider world. A doxological approach then suits contexts where there is commitment or at least consent from staff and families to a religiously framed education. It is appropriate then to faith schools where acceptance of such aims is part of the admissions and recruitment processes. Not all schools of a religious character interpret their faith status in this way. The head of another Church of England primary described the Christianity of her school as lived but not proclaimed. But the doxological approach accords with an influential strand of current thinking about faith education, in which distinctiveness is the key word. The aims and policies described have much in common with the recommendations of The Way Ahead, Lord Deering's report on the future of Church of England schools, 2001, which viewed the role of church schools as one of mission and recommended that they offer a distinctive language for understanding life and interpreting human experience and serve as a mirror of God. In his case, it reflects the nature of the Trinity in the community. So that's the doxological. Now to move to the sacramental. The sacramental approach does not assume the existence of a transcendent God, as the doxological does, but rather it opens up before young people the possibility of this existence, and it allows them to talk and to react as if it were real. It doesn't encompass the whole life of the school, but marks out places and moments of religious significance. This is not so much finding space for religion as opening up portals from the school into something or the possibility of something greater than the immediately perceptible material world. And the obvious portals to this reality might be assumed to be RE and collective worship. The difference between sacramental and non-sacramental approaches to RE can be demonstrated through the example of a primary school teacher with a class of predominantly Christian West African heritage students. Initially, she used in RE lessons those distancing, objectifying qualifiers commonly recommended in training for RE teaching. Christians believe that, many Christians think that, and so on. But she found this language about religion did not come naturally to her students and decided to adjust her practice and use the children's own language, as she said. Thus, she allowed direct reference to God as a person rather than as a concept, enabling the exploration of God's nature into her lessons. By this move, she avoided the use of circumlocutory language by which, to use the words of RE specialist Marius Felderhoff, and also those of Kierkegaard, to admit that one exists before God, which entails fear and trembling, becomes a claim about human beliefs concerning God. Instead, the fear and trembling of the possibility of God's reality was evident in an observed lesson on Jonah, where the children explored attributes of justice and forgiveness as applied to God and the tensions between them. They puzzled over the strangeness of God speaking to humans, and they were free to push their religious language and understanding to their limits. A lesson observed in another school, not a faith school, introduced the nativity to less religiously versed students in a similar fashion, and the teacher, working with that suspension of disbelief that's of the kind sort of common to a good storyteller, fired their imagination with a tale of heavenly angels and miraculous birth. The employment of religious artifacts in RE lessons often displays the characteristics of sacramental approaches. Examples include a quasi-liturgical representation of Shabbat for a class of 6-year-olds who are not Jewish themselves, lighting candles, uncovering the challah bread and passing round the spice box contributed to an evocation of sacred meaning, which was met with attentive reverence from the children. The teacher reported how they had been similarly impressed by a Torah scroll brought into class. That just inspired a lot of awe and wonder moments. Really, it was so special that you mustn't touch it. The teacher used symbol and ritual to encourage a sense of the numinous. This opening a portal not only gave children a glimpse of something beyond, or the possibility of something beyond, but allowed the extraordinary into the classroom, giving new meanings to ordinary actions and ordinary everyday objects performed and seen there. Collective worship events are likely times for a school to adopt a sacramental approach to religion. At the faith schools and the schools with a high proportion of students from religious families, they often mirrored the practices of the faith communities. Other schools, where few students had religious background or affiliation, were not exempt from religiously oriented collective worship. The government circular, DFE 197, states boldly, collective worship in schools should aim to provide the opportunity for students to worship God. In a later paragraph, the document provides a concise definition of a sacramental approach to religion. Collective worship must, in some sense, reflect something special or separate from ordinary school activities. It should be concerned with reverence for a divine being or power. A lot of collective worship reported during the research in no way fitted these descriptions, being focused on recognising pupils' achievements, passing on school information, marking significant events in the community, and offering generalised moral messages. Less constraint in collective worship at the two traditional independent schools, however, which you might expect, involving Christian hymns at the junior school, the secondary school compulsory chapel attendance with full Anglican liturgy. The head of the junior school hoped that the collective worship would give chances for reflection to encourage children's prayerfulness and lead them into having a spiritual dimension. At the senior school, the prospectus set out expectations that the worship and life of the chapel will develop through instruction, exposition, and imaginative appeal, a sense of the beauty of holiness. So the sacramental approach then, it combines opportunity and freedom of response. Schools can take students to the threshold, offer a glimpse of what may be beyond, but they cannot take them over. So we have a doxological approach, a sacramental approach. The doxological approach bases schools' life and mission on sure belief in God's existence. Sacramental is open to the possibility, allowing activities and learning at certain times in the life of the school to be conducted as if God existed, inviting a suspension of disbelief. An instrumental approach, though, doesn't deny the possibility, but adopts a default skepticism and is implemented as though there were not a reality beyond the material world and human construction. An instrumental approach incorporates religion into the school's other purposes. It may be based on positive understandings of religion's contributions to the aims of the institution, for example, to intellectual or moral development, or the social cohesion of school and community. Or there may be, we found, more negative perceptions viewing religion as a problem or a risk to be contained, and perhaps using RE as an instrument for this containment. Either way, the school's approach to religion is framed in separate terms. In English RE, there's a common distinction made between learning about and learning from religion, and the case studies found that the status given to learning from objectives meant that what might be otherwise viewed as secondary learning in RE, moral development, thinking skills, attitudes, became the prime focus. So, for example, interpretation of Jesus' parables in one primary school focused not on interpretation about God or the kingdom, but on generalised moral messages seen to be relevant to the children's everyday lives. So the story of the pearl of great price is about things precious to me, and the lost sheep teaches never give up. In secondary schools, moral development tended to be viewed as ethical choices. Several used issues-based RE, introducing students to current ethical debates and supplying them with a variety of perspectives, religious and non-religious, to consider. The issues themselves thus became the focus of the lesson, and the religious content as a secondary responsive role. At one school, students described the content of the RE course thus: the things we learn about in RE are topical issues like violence and abortion, euthanasia, equality, that sort of stuff that affects us on an everyday basis. I rather hope it doesn't. And it's about having a better understanding of everyone's beliefs on these. Teachers valued RE for its contribution to the development of thinking skills. One secondary RE head of department declared her aim was to develop the students' thinking skills so they can look at any kind of evidence and make opinions for themselves. Another in a church school, actually, where most students held firm Christian beliefs, hoped that RE would challenge them and liberate them from unthinking, untested assumptions. This emphasis on rationality and evidence reflects a recent philosophical turn in RE and accords with current critical pedagogies. Instrumental approaches also respond to societal concerns, may be directed to the well-being of the whole community or to the future good of a wider society. Teaching about other people's religions was an important part of the educational programme at all the schools. Several teachers were principally interested in what religions tell about the people who profess them, and as one said, RE plays a vital role in developing understanding of other people's religious and faith cultures, where they are coming from, why they are thinking the way they do, what their beliefs are. And they viewed this understanding as a precondition for intercommunal harmony. At several schools, teachers articulated the principles of inclusivity and multiculturalism. In primary school, students acted out these principles in celebrations of various religious festivals through drama, art and song. Students at the Jewish school chalked huge Rangoli patterns on their playground for Diwali. Those in a rural infant school decorated their classroom with paper lanterns for Chinese New Year. Some teachers, however, expressed concerns about the divisive potential of religion, sometimes linked to anxieties about intergroup relationships within the school community, and sometimes to concerns about divisions in wider society. A shift from celebration to concern was evident in curriculum changes in the Roman Catholic secondary school, where the focus of their other religions study had changed from Hinduism to Islam. The RE head of departments explained Hinduism was colourful, it was so different, the kids loved it, but we felt Islam post 9/11, it was essential to have that social necessity. Such observations accord with official guidance for teaching RE in a world that defines itself by the events of 9/11. 2007, an official report on the state of RE, Making Sense of Religion, asked, is religious education responding effectively to the changing social reality of religion post 9/11? It insisted RE cannot ignore its role in fostering community cohesion, a role given renewed urgency by current changes in society, that RE cannot ignore controversy and should dispense with the notion that students should be taught to think uncritically of religion as a good thing. So, having set out 3 approaches to religion in school, I shall now consider briefly the conversations between religious and secular present and all possible in each. In the field of education, and this is partly why we're here today, conversation between religious and secular perspectives is often antagonistic, not that we're being antagonistic, and the debates are polarised. There is, we know, this long-standing and bitter debate about faith schools carried out in the media and the educational world. There's also the concern among some figures in the RE community about what they call the secularisation of schools and the secularisation of RE in particular. It's very helpful to be aware of these views, and there is value in the deconstruction of the idea that the secular is somehow neutral ground. Nevertheless, there's also a danger of descending into a power struggle between secularists and religionists, with positions hardening on either side. It's not very helpful. Instead, in our religious and secular society, we need to work for what Cambridge theologian David Ford terms a religious and secular settlement that all can enter without compromising their own position. Such a settlement requires reasons acceptable to secular perspectives for engaging with religion, reasons acceptable to religious perspectives for engaging with the secular world, and genuine attempts at mutual understanding. Jürgen Habermas's name is used a lot in this context, I think, and he provides a secular argument for the inclusion of religious perspectives in society. He starts by arguing that it is unacceptable in a liberal democracy that the religious citizens should currently bear the unfair burden, being expected to translate their thoughts into secular terms before they can be heard in the public sphere. He proposes a cooperative task of translation, whereby secular citizens listen to the religious voices and the religious reasons of their neighbours and ensure their incorporation into the public agenda. Religious citizens are required to adapt to their secular environment, but this process must not conflict with their faith. Secular citizens must be prepared to engage imaginatively with religious perspectives. Mere tolerance is not enough. It requires of secular citizens a self-reflective transcending of a secularist self-understanding of modernity. David Ford views this cooperation between religious and secular from a religious perspective and argues that the right ordering of the religious and secular in this world is achieved through the realization of the right relationship between the ultimate and penultimate. For the religious person, to compromise this relationship is to risk idolatry. This formula doesn't devalue the penultimate. While from a religious perspective the peace and well-being of human society may be penultimate to the ultimacy of God, it may nevertheless be viewed as God's purpose for his creation. Nor does it propose that the religious is right and the secular the wrong relationship, but rather that a religious and secular settlement can't be achieved unless the religious can enter into it without compromising the order of that relationship religiously understood. It's also worth noting that it may be the religious person or community who distorts the relationship. This point is expanded by Tom Greggs in an article where he argues through Bonhoeffer that religious people's anxieties about secularization can generate a defensiveness, prompting them to give their religion priority over God. So how do schools fit into this discussion? Well, I intend to answer this question in a couple of minutes by taking each of the 3 approaches to religion in turn, starting with the doxological approach that can be found in some faith schools. Yes. Great analysis actually does have some relevance to some faith schools, where concerns to ensure the continuation of their faith community or safeguard its purity from secular contamination can encourage an inward-looking stance. I think Morris mentioned this earlier. So community, rather than God, becomes the primary focus of desire. The case study schools, characterised by their doxological approach, may have shared these concerns. Part of the Jewish primary school's mission was to reconnect Jewish families with their religion. But they were not limited by them, not these schools. Instead, their approach both acknowledged God as the foundation of their community and directed them outside that community, so that by engaging with wider society they could seek and serve God there. To recognise God as the ultimate is to acknowledge that God is God of all the world, to be ready to find God in unexpected places beyond the school and faith community and serve him there. Recognising God as God of all the world means that children who are taught to live their lives in reference to that God can develop a sense of confidence and belonging within the secular environment. This confidence is demonstrated by children of the Islamic primary school, for example, as they dig in the neighbourhood allotments, sing nasheeds in the older people's home. Right relationship between ultimate and penultimate thus encourages faith schools to engage in conversation with secular society. And in keeping with inclusive and egalitarian values in that society, this conversation also requires secular citizens to hear and consider their religious reasons for that engagement. A sacramental approach supports the relationship between ultimate and penultimate required by religious sensibilities, even when the school's life and learning is framed in predominantly secular terms, by acknowledging the possibility of something greater beyond the confines of the material and the human. Designated moments for religion, such as RE lessons and collective worship, though they may be restricted in time, are open portals to the challenges and possibilities of a greater mystery and infinite meaning that continues to exist even when those portals are closed. A sacramental approach generates more than cognitive responses from the students, encouraging a sense of awe and wonder, perhaps of fear and trembling. But it moves beyond an a-religious spirituality and an inner self-focus. Because the styles of teaching characterised as sacramental make explicit reference to an ultimate reality. The Shabbat artifact spoke of God's creation. The Torah scroll was special because it was believed to be God's word. The effect can be decentering as the children experience how the extraordinary God ruptures the comfortable boundaries of the ordinary, a candle, bread, paper and ink, and gives it a new significance. Similarly, the children's disorientation, as they struggled with concepts of divine justice in the story of Jonah, was precisely the point at which the portal was opened to the challenges and mysteries of the possibility of God. The openness of this approach allows for agnosticism and disbelief, and so may be appropriate both for non-faith schools and for faith schools with non-religious students. But it brings those non-religious students near enough to the threshold to gain some comprehension of what it might be like to have a religious faith, and so to understand better the reasons of their religious neighbours or classmates. And finally, I've argued that in religious and secular settlement, both religious and secular reasons are needed for the inclusion of religion in the public arena, and suggested that both can be found for doxological and sacramental approaches. The fact that instrumental approaches, the last of the three, by definition are led by secular concerns, educational, institutional, societal, does not mean that they cannot be justified from religious perspectives. Learning how different people interpret their experience of God can lead to greater understanding of one's fellow human and one's own theology. But I've also argued that both religious and secular purposes can only be met by a religiously understood religion. The difficulty for instrumental approaches is that by giving primacy to secular aims, they can easily distort the religion they present. Others have documented this distortion of religious content. The late Terence Copley, for example, in his research into the use of the Bible in RE, found that concerns to tailor RE to pupils' existing experience and use it as a tool for moral development in effect reduced religion to a worthy banality, God replaced by do-goodery. Observations of lessons in the case study school sometimes found similar conclusions. The evidence-based critical thinking approaches found to be popular in several of the case study schools have themselves met with criticism. Rowan Williams finds the conception of religion underlying these approaches seriously inadequate. The sense of fit, the sense of compulsion by a story of authoritative and total transformation of the world's self-definition, the sense of personal address or vocation, of personal and corporate liberation, and so on. All these things are habitually involved in retaining or acquiring religious belief, but are significantly different from a process of evaluating evidence. Learning about people of other faiths in order to understand them better provides a valuable basis for engagement in a religious and secular society. However, educators need to be careful that students' understanding is not limited by the anthropocentric premises behind such approaches. In a laudable concern to get to know our religious neighbours better, it is easy to treat religions as bounded sociological phenomena attached to different cultural groups. So it's Allah is something Muslims believe in rather than these are the ways in which Muslims respond to God. Relationship between ultimate and penultimate is reversed. What seems to be distortion from a religious perspective may appear to represent reality from a secular perspective. Nevertheless, grasping the significance of religion to one's religious neighbours requires taking a step outside the secular frame, as Habermas suggests, and attempting, as far as the imagination allows, to view their experiences and motivations through their eyes of faith, not just secular eyes of sociology. To lay oneself open to the awe and wonder or the fear and trembling. And it's perhaps at this point, understanding the religion of others, that instrumental ends can be served by sacramental approaches. And I'm going to stop there because I've had my 40 minutes. Okay, thank you very much.